It is First Chapter Friday once again. This week I'm going to read the first chapter of The Lost Ryu by Emi Wantanabe Cohen. In fact, I won't read the whole first chapter, just part. Chapter 1, Anger and Memories. There were no big dragons in Japan, and there hadn't been for a very long time. To most kids Kohi's age, full-size Ryu felt about as real as the cowboys in American films. Maybe they had been part of history once, but now they were the stuff of legend. Nobody expected to run into John Wayne on their way to the market, and no one had encountered a big Ryu since bombs fell over Hiroshima and Nagasaki almost 20 years ago. Kohei was 10 years old. He shouldn't have been able to remember the big Ryu at all. He shouldn't have known how enormous they were, or how their tails could crush entire apartment buildings with a single careless swipe, or how their bodies coiled as they lumbered through the cracked streets, slow and majestic, thick tufts of fur glimmering in the wind. He definitely shouldn't have remembered the sound of their talons crunching against asphalt. But as most kids know, should has very little to do with memories. Kohei remembered the Ryu parade. It couldn't have been a dream. It was so real, so much like a memory. It had to have been in real life. The streets were well weathered and worn, and the skies were clear and bright, and when Kohei tilted his head back, he spotted a western dragon circling high in the clouds. It had such huge, pointy wings. Western dragons looked more like birds or bats than the serpent-like Japanese Ryu that Kohei was accustomed to. He had never seen a real Western dragon before, and he thought this one was unspeakably beautiful in a brutal sort of way. Kohei wanted to be beautiful and brutal, and he so wanted to fly. Japanese dragons, Ryu, could technically travel through the air, but only when it was raining. They were creatures of water and mist. The ancient Ryu that lived thousands of years ago had harnessed the clouds in order to fly, shaping the air with their talons. Unless it was raining really hard, the tiny Ryu that lived in Japan now could barely even hover. In Kohei's impossible memory, the crowds of people jostling around him barely seemed to notice the circling Western dragon. They were too busy staring at the parade of Ryu marching down the street. Kohei didn't mind the jostling for the most part, and he didn't bother looking at the people's faces, except one, his grandfather's. Oji-san stood near the front of the crowd, gazing at the big Ryu with an odd look in his eyes. He was younger, much younger than Kohei had ever seen him. He had dark hair and brush-thick eyebrows, and his familiar face seemed fuller than usual, even though he'd clearly been starving for months. His eyes were different too. They were clear, shrewd, and focused. His grandfather Kohei knew, was loud and bitter and numb, and he drank too much to focus on anything. And without a little Ryu on his shoulder, he was always alone. Lots of people outlived their Ryu, but most found new ones to keep them company after a while. Oji-san never had, and now he was too tired to even try. This was the only memory Kohei had of the big Ryu, and it wasn't even a memory he was supposed to have. He had to assume that made it important. So when Oji-san had too much to drink and started throwing things against the wall, Kohei went over that impossible memory in his mind over and over again, studying every detail, trying to figure it out. 20 years ago, Oji-san had tears in his eyes. Maybe tears of joy, maybe tears of sorrow. Real tears either way. And he was looking up at the big Ryu as they marched through the street. There were no big Ryu left in Japan anymore, and Oji-san never laughed or cried. He only yelled and drank. Therefore, Oji-san missed the big Ryu. It was the simplest conclusion Kohei could come to. His father would have called it Occam's razor, which meant the most straightforward answer is the one that's most likely to be true. If the big Ryu came back, Oji-san would finally be able to feel good things again. He needed them to come back, which was unfortunate because big Ryu were even less real than cowboys. At least John Wayne was still alive. The big Ryu were extinct and had been for nearly 20 years. I think that gives us a good idea about the setting and a little clue into the rest of this really fantastic story. Please check out The Lost Ryu from the Alameda Free Library. See you next time on First Chapter